Bonsoir à toutes, bonsoir à tous. Merci d'être là pour cette deuxième soirée de notre semaine à l'école de l'Anthropocène. Le débat de ce soir est en continuité avec celui d'hier où nous avons réfléchi à l'habitabilité de la planète. Et là, nous allons nous poser la question de la conquête de l'espace en essayant de l'aborder à travers le regard de spécialistes de questions géopolitiques, juridiques, archéologiques, mais aussi via un auteur important de ce que l'on appelle couramment la science-fiction, qui a fait travailler son imagination pour essayer de nous emporter sur des planètes conquises par l'homme et terraformées par l'homme. Et nous allons avoir une soirée en deux temps. Tout d'abord, Vincent Véchambre, ici présent, qui est le directeur du RISE, ce lieu qui nous accueille, et je le remercie véritablement de cet accueil, va avoir une conversation de 45 minutes à peu près avec Kim Stanley Robinson, qui est un grand auteur de science-fiction, qui a écrit des livres marquants pour les amateurs de ce genre, et il nous expliquera la façon dont il travaille. À la suite de cette conversation, nous enchaînerons. Bonjour Kim, le voici, il apparaît à l'écran. Et à la suite de cette conversation, nous aurons un débat entre Isabelle Sourbès-Verger, qui est géographe, historienne et spécialiste de géopolitique de la conquête de l'espace circumterrestre, et Alice Gorman, qui sera en direct d'Adélaïde, en Australie. Elle s'est levée très tôt pour être avec nous, qui elle est spécialiste d'archéologie de l'espace, et nous essaierons de réfléchir à cette conquête de l'espace circumterrestre ou extraterrestre et de ce que ça peut nous dire de notre société terrestre. Bonne soirée, et je conduirai donc la deuxième partie du débat, et je laisse Vincent avec Kim Stanley Robinson, que je remercie chaleureusement d'être présent ce soir avec nous. Alors, Kim Stanley Robinson, je vous dis à nouveau bonjour. Nous nous sommes salués quelques instants auparavant. C'est un très très grand plaisir de vous avoir avec nous ce soir. Et pour introduire notre conversation, trois sujets qui, à mon sens, vous me direz ce que vous en pensez, font cette nouvelle actualité, pourrait-on dire, de la conquête spatiale. Cette nouvelle actualité d'une extension annoncée de l'œcumène, donc de cet espace approprié, occupé, conquis par l'homme. Alors, trois sujets d'actualité, c'est pour commencer la question des enjeux géopolitiques qui, je dirais, se confirment ou s'affirment autour des projets d'occupation. C'est déjà un fait très avéré, mais d'occupation de l'orbite de la Terre, l'espace le plus proche, avec des projets colossaux en termes de déploiement de satellites. On parle de dizaines de milliers de satellites. Ce sont des projets aussi qui redeviennent d'actualité autour du retour sur la Lune, qui serait qu'un marchepied pour aller sur Mars, qui serait la cible suivante. Et donc on imagine effectivement tous les enjeux scientifiques, politiques, économiques qui sont derrière ces projets. Deuxième grand faisceau d'actualité, ce qu'on pourrait appeler les nouveaux acteurs de la conquête spatiale. Et ça aussi, je pense que ça peut vous parler, à savoir que ce ne sont plus seulement les grandes entités géopolitiques du monde, enfin en tout cas les États, comme durant la guerre froide, mais aujourd'hui se positionnent des puissances capitalistes transnationales incarnées par des figures comme Elon Musk ou Jeff Bezos. Et puis, dernier sujet d'actualité qui m'a frappé, mais pas que moi, c'est cette passion actuelle de l'humanité pour la découverte des exoplanètes. Et nous avons vu le déploiement de moyens colossaux pour cela, avec la mise en orbite du télescope James Webb récemment. Voilà, donc trois grands sujets qui, à mon sens, posent cette actualité. Et ça tombe bien, vous faites partie des auteurs majeurs qui nous aident à réfléchir à tout ça depuis maintenant plusieurs décennies, depuis les années 70, à travers un corpus littéraire considérable et passionnant. Au croisement, on y reviendra, exact de la fiction et de la science. Alors pour vous présenter Kim Stanley Robinson, et vous me direz si vous êtes d'accord, je dirais que vous êtes singulier dans la science-fiction contemporaine sur deux points. Le premier point, c'est que vous vous situez dans une échelle de temps et d'espace qui est originale. Alors je précise, vous n'êtes pas sur le temps très long, Hein, on n'est pas chez Frank Herbert dans Dune, on n'est pas dans Star Wars, hein, il y a bien longtemps, dans une galaxie lointaine, très lointaine. On n'est pas dans le space opéra. On n'est pas non plus dans le temps court, dans l'anticipation de quelques dizaines d'années. On est dans ce que j'appellerais un temps intermédiaire, hein, quelques centaines d'années. Et puis on est aussi dans un espace intermédiaire. On n'est pas dans les galaxies lointaines. On est bien souvent et principalement, avec une exception près, on y reviendra, dans le système solaire. Et je voulais d'abord vous demander pourquoi, Kim Stanley Robinson, ce choix d'une échelle d'espace et d'une échelle de temps qui sont, je dirais, intermédiaires, qui vous sont propres.
Well, thank you for that very much. I appreciate the question because I myself have analyzed science fiction as being stories set in the future. And most of them are either the far future, and we call that space opera in America. As you described it, distant galaxies into millions of years in the future with powers that are magical. Or what I call near future science fiction, the day after tomorrow, a sense of the present slightly extended to show trajectories of the present. These are both valid and entertaining fictional spaces. I've done a lot of near future. I haven't done very much that you could call space opera, if any, but a little bit. And then that intermediate zone that you identified is indeed what I have felt is important and interesting and underwritten by science fiction writers. So I sometimes call it future history, a bit, but not in the Asimov sense, but in the sense of it's exactly what you said, maybe a half century to about 300 years out from now is thinkable as a kind of a future realism. You can stick to the laws of physics. You can stick to the neighborhood, by which I mean the solar system, which is technically within our reach. As with the technologies we have now, you don't need magic. The solar system is our neighborhood, cosmically speaking. And even Neptune is way closer to Earth than the closest star by magnitudes, by distances that are very hard to properly imagine for human beings. And on the time scale, humans are going to be on Earth and struggling with climate change and with all the problems we're dealing with now. 200 years from now, that struggle will be ongoing, and it's interesting to contemplate. And as a kind of since this conference is on the impacts of space, in the next 200 years, the neighborhood, which is to say the solar system, it won't be critical to human history, I don't believe, but it will be interesting and helpful and part of the story. And since it's a kind of an empty ecological niche in our cultural imaginary, I've found my stories there very often.
Autre singularité, c'est comme ça que je le dirais cela, c'est votre revendication très forte de l'étiquette science-fiction. Et quand vous dites cela, vous assumez pleinement le fait d'être du côté de la fiction, du roman, hein, d'être aussi sensible à la poésie de la langue. Et dans le même temps, vous vous nourrissez de la science, ou plutôt des sciences, hein, les sciences dures, les sciences sociales, pour produire un très fort effet de réel. Là aussi, c'est quelque chose, je crois, que vous revendiquez. J'aurais voulu que vous nous disiez qu'est-ce qui vous a conduit dans votre parcours intellectuel à vous positionner ainsi, à la croisée, hein, de la fiction et de la science.
Well, thank you for this also. It has been a crucial question to my life as an artist, and I myself have been mystified as to why I chose this route. But when I ran into science fiction in the early 1970s, it was a revelation, and I felt that I had come to my place in literature. The It could be that my childhood in orange groves, replaced by a city, was the thing that made me feel that science fiction was a kind of a realism. And so I come to it as an English major and as a novelist. I would like to write a good novel. But what is a good novel in 1980 and in 2020? Over the stretch of my long career, I would say a good novel has to take into account reality. That's one of the things that it attempts to do, is to almost define social and personal reality, to give our lived experience its meaning. And therefore, the sciences are crucial. We live in a world that has been created by science and that is sustained by science. And also, as a novelist, I'm a storyteller, the new stories are coming out of the sciences. So if you do what you could call domestic realism or mainstream literature or literary fiction, I don't even know what the term would be in French, but in America, those would be the terms. You're stuck in the early 20th century in terms of form and content. The life of the bourgeois subject and their immediate surroundings, their personal crises. You haven't taken on history or the planet, and science fiction does that all the time. So to get right to the answer of your question, my main drive would be to write a good novel, which requires exactly what Roland Barthes termed l'effet du réel, the effect of the real. When you're reading it, you want to feel that it's real. And I felt like diving into the sciences has strengthened the reality effect of my novels. Now, this is a little paradoxical because setting stories in the future means immediately a level of fictionality. How can you be both realistic and set a story in the future? Well, this has been my problem to solve in book after book.
Alors, je vous propose maintenant à Kim Stanley Robinson de partir en voyage, de partir en voyage à travers quelques ouvrages parmi ceux que je qualifierais d'extraterrestres. Alors, il y en a un auquel je suis très très sensible. Il s'appelle Ice Age. Alors c'est en référence, la traduction française n'est pas terrible, mais c'est en référence à Stone Age, donc c'est un monument de glace découvert sur la planète Pluton. Nous sommes en 2610, au plus loin dans le temps finalement où vous nous emmenez, hein, dans ce que j'ai pu lire. C'est le temps, je dirais, la projection la plus lointaine. Et ce livre de 1984, j'ai l'impression qu'il porte un peu tous les grands thèmes que vous allez ensuite développer. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec ça ?
Yes, maybe that's true. And this is good because Alice will come on next and be talking about space archaeology. And Ice Age is specifically about a fictional space archaeological project. The first people to go to Pluto discover a human monument already there. Who put it there and when and why? And I think it's called Les Menhirs du Glace in French, and that's a pretty good translation. And I'd like to see the menhirs in person someday in Brittany and Normandy. So the other addition to that story was lifetime extension. And the reason I put it in the year 2600 was in part to allow the effect of thinking about long human lifetimes to really impact the reader, to make a new story. So if humans were to live 500 years, but they only remembered their childhood like by flashes of lightning, and then the last 30 years of their life, that wouldn't be much different from the way our memories work now, but there would be a giant gap of unremembered lived experience. So you also would be an archaeologist of your own life as you tried to remember what you've done and people might remember you that you don't remember. Again, this happens to us now, but with vastly extended lifetimes, you could also have an archaeologist who has a theory of where this ice hinge came from. Everybody believes him, and he lives long enough to see that he has been fooled and that it was a hoax and that he was taken in by a hoax. Typically, archaeologists die before their work is revealed to be inaccurate. And as a news story, I thought to combine these two new strands. To end this, thank you for asking about Ice Hinge. I'm fond of it. It's the first work of mine that I was pleased with. And I would say that it began all kinds of strands of thought that I've never stopped exploring. In particular, human civilization spread through the solar system on the planetary bodies that we could reach and possibly inhabit.
Et alors, une grande partie de ce premier livre que j'évoque, Les menhirs de glace, se déroule sur Mars. Et là, on va aller du côté de Mars très, très précisément. C'est la trilogie. C'est Red Mars, c'est Green Mars, c'est Blue Mars dans les années 90, et puis un recueil The Martians en 1999. Comment en êtes-vous venu à vous emparer de Mars aussi longtemps, aussi profondément, plus de 2000 pages sur une dizaine d'années, et en quoi vous l'avez fait de manière aussi nouvelle? Parce que Mars est une vieille histoire en science-fiction, mais là, vous nous proposez quelque chose qui est radicalement nouveau.
Yes, thank you for that. I agree. And what happened was this. The Viking landers, Mariner and Viking in 1969 and 1976, gave us Mars in an enormous amount of detail that we had never had before. So you could not have written anything like the Mars trilogy before 1976, and it took a while to assimilate all that new data. And I also was gathering my strength as a novelist. It was clear to me that the story of inhabiting and terraforming Mars would be an epic novel requiring some formal techniques that I didn't know about, that I somewhat had to invent or adapt from earlier novels that covered huge spans of time. For me, about 200 years. The novel usually covers a human lifetime or less. And the multi-generational saga is not very satisfying, but here, lifetime extension from Ice Hinge came into play. And I realized I could have characters live through the entire stretch of the terraforming of Mars by the science fictional device, which is probably the most fantastical of all my science fiction devices, because lifetime extension is very hard, as we're finding. So I had a chance to talk about utopia, and I had a chance to talk about wilderness and landscape, because we had this extraordinary planet, which is, what we found out is that its geological features are tremendously ancient compared to Earth's, because there's been no tectonic plate movement on Mars for a couple of billion years. And we also have got gigantic features on Mars, so that the biggest volcano is 100 times bigger than the biggest volcano on Earth. The biggest canyon is 100 times bigger than the biggest canyon on Earth. Now, 100 times, that's big. That's almost unimaginable, but there we could see it in the satellite photos. And at the time, the scientists were saying we might be able to terraform Mars. That opinion has been somewhat compromised in the decades since I finished. But while I was working, I was trying to stay within the parameters of what the real scientists were telling us about what was possible on Mars. And it was an exciting opportunity. And here's the main point. It was an exciting opportunity to write a novel about a new story. So I took it as a novelist, not as a futures planner, not as a social designer. Whether it's a good idea for us to try to inhabit Mars, now I have no opinion. Whether it was a good idea to write a novel about this project, I'm still convinced it was a good idea when I did it.
Alors, vous dites en avoir fini avec Mars. Alors, je suppose que vous continuez à jeter un petit coup d'œil intéressé, malgré tout, à ce qui se dit aujourd'hui. Et qu'est-ce que vous inspire finalement les intentions actuellement formulées à l'égard de cette planète, et notamment, par exemple, par le fondateur de SpaceX, qui nous vend la terraformation de Mars? Voilà, qu'est-ce que ça vous inspire, les discours très actuels sur le futur d'une conquête de Mars?
They're making an error, a category error. They're not paying attention to the most recent science, and they're not paying attention to the climate crisis, an existential crisis on Earth. Right now, Mars is irrelevant. It has no bearing on the emergency that is the main project of humanity in this century, which is to adjust human civilization to the biosphere that supports it in a sustainable way. So I'm surprised anybody is paying attention to Mars right now. It's exactly as important as Antarctica, although maybe less so. Antarctica is important because we need its ice to stay there. But humans in Antarctica are scientists doing scientific studies. It's interesting, it's beautiful, it's important for understanding Earth. Mars is precisely the same. To have humans there would be like scientists in Antarctica. It would be interesting, it would be beautiful, it would teach us things that might help us to manage Earth as a planet, to finesse or deal with or cope with problems we've created, because comparative planetology is a real important aspect of human maintenance of Earth. So I'm not saying that Mars is completely irrelevant as a site of scientific study. I'm saying that Mars is irrelevant as an important aid to human civilization right now. And I now regard it as a reward. If we were to come into a good balance with Earth, if we make a sustainable civilization on Earth, we'll know it. The CO2 in the atmosphere will start going down. The mass extinction event will be dodged. There will be more justice and equality amongst humans, less suffering. The human population will stabilize and probably begin to go down. And at that point, only at that point, Mars becomes interesting again as a space for human imagination and perhaps inhabitation. It's not right to call it colonization because it's not going to be a colony. Terraforming might be a 10,000-year project rather than a 200-year project. That means it's still a legitimate idea. But for private interests right now to be thinking about Mars or speaking about it as if it were important, it's as if they've taken science fiction too seriously as a blueprint. And I'm going to say, as a novelist, as one of the foremost living Martians, that this is an entirely hypothetical and literary project. And as a real idea, at best, it's a hobby. I'd be interested to know, I think that in French there is the word for hobbies, and French implies exactly what it would be in English. It's something you do on the side to entertain yourself in your leisure time. It's not important. Your hobby is a kind of a personal quirk of your personality. And that's what Mars is for anybody who's serious about it today.
Oui, donc cet échappatoire ou ce hobby, comme vous dites à l'instant, on y reviendra peut-être avant de clore notre échange. Juste peut-être une dernière remarque sur ce qui, je dirais, marquait aussi une vision forte de notre futur, qui me semble toujours présente, c'est que cette planète-là, elle est finalement appropriée, dans votre récit bien sûr, appropriée, conquise, colonisée par les transnationales. Et là, il y a quelque chose, je trouve, qui rentre en résonance par rapport à ce qui se dit et se joue aujourd'hui sur la conquête de l'espace, hein, sur le positionnement de nouveaux acteurs. Est-ce que ça, c'est quelque chose qui, à votre sens, reste toujours très, très fort et très, très actuel dans votre propos de la trilogie martienne?
Yes, I am interested, very interested, as everyone should be, in how humanity behaves in space, treats space, and legislates space as we go forward from now. Because our capabilities in low Earth orbit, our capabilities in space telescopes, we will almost certainly return to the moon in this decade. And in theory, although it's extremely difficult and dangerous, we could perhaps land on Mars. But to keep it in the Earth system, Earth and the moon, there's, you can make money now with communication satellites connecting up the world. So the internet is partly a phenomenon of space and could be more so. Then also the scientific information that we get out of low Earth orbit and on the moon is valuable to us in dealing with climate change. And then lastly, there are certain resources, and there's also satellites. There are problems you can ask me more specifically about, but let me bring this answer to a close by saying space should be regarded as a commons, like the ocean, can't be owned by anybody, but commercial activities can take place there, maybe. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was based on the Antarctic Treaty. It has always been controversial, and it never had much applicability. So, in other words, it was legislating a situation that didn't yet exist, and when the situation came into being, the Outer Space Treaty was too weak and somewhat ignored. It still obtains, the signatories are still signers. And so now push has come to shove. And one of the most interesting problems, and I hope Alice will talk about this, too many satellites will ruin ground-based astronomy and also ruin humanity's sense of the night sky as a natural and sublime, magnificent, and overwhelming experience. If it's junked up by thousands of moving lights, then the night sky is a commons that is of spiritual value, and the satellites may ruin it. So now we really do have a problem. Who rules in space, and will they be obeyed? And if people are bad actors, is there any possibility of undoing their bad actions? And these are all present questions.
On se met de côté précieusement ces considérations, ces ouvertures que vous nous proposez sur les communs et sur la question du droit et sur la question de qui écrit justement la loi des hommes. Je voudrais juste terminer notre voyage. Vous nous proposez de revenir sur Terre et la comparaison que vous faites avec l'Antarctique revient à plusieurs reprises. Hein. L'Antarctique dont vous le dites finalement que c'est Mars avec les deux pieds sur Terre. J'avais trouvé cette jolie formule. Donc revenons sur Terre, c'est finalement le récit d'Aurora, hein, que vous avez publié en 2015. Ce roman qui sort de votre champ d'investigation habituel, l'humanité, en tout cas un fragment d'humanité, tente de s'échapper du système solaire pour rejoindre le système de Toseti, la planète Aurora, l'a bien nommée, mais de manière assez pathétique, on pourrait dire, cette expédition menée sur plusieurs générations est contrainte au retour. Contrainte au retour sur Terre face à la dangerosité d'une toxine présente sur cette planète. C'est un des problèmes, ce n'est pas le seul. Et donc, j'aimerais que vous nous commentiez cet ouvrage qui, encore une fois, je trouve, sort de l'ordinaire par rapport à vos ouvrages précédents, parce qu'il change d'échelle, hein, et qu'il pose la question des limites, et qui nous ramène vraiment sur Terre. Donc, est-ce que vous pouvez nous commenter finalement ce qui fait la conclusion de cet ouvrage, avec une trentaine de pages magnifiques au bord de l'océan, la conclusion finalement de ce retour et de ce final de l'ouvrage, quelle est-elle?
Yes, thank you for that. I'm interested to describe that project. I began to believe that the science fiction story, which is a more general cultural idea also, that humanity is destined to go to the stars, was wrong and was a fantasy based on a misapprehension of the size of the universe and the complexity of human biology. So part of this came in right with Hubble. The idea that humanity would go to the stars is an old idea, ancient Greeks or 19th century, Tsiolkovsky in Russia, a dream. And they didn't know until Hubble did his discoveries in astronomy, the true size of the universe, and never took on that information that the stars are too far away. And if you regard light speed as an absolute limit, which I'm going to say you ought to, then even at a considerable percentage of light speed, it takes too long to get to the stars. And so science fiction had solved that problem by what is called the multi-generational starship. It's not magic. You get in a starship that is hopefully very capacious and filled, like Noah's Ark, filled with everything you would want when you got there. And then you'd cross the big spaces between stars by multi-generations living within it as if it was their world. And for many generations, it would be their one and only world, the interior of the starship. And then I heard about the microbiome, our gut microbiome. 50% of the DNA in your body is not human DNA. And at that point, I thought, no, this story is impossible. Humanity can't stay healthy, stuck inside a set of rooms, which is what a starship would be, for multiple generations away from Earth. And I began to realize something that the sciences are telling us. Humanity is an expression of Earth. It co-evolved with Earth. The magnetic field, the air pressure, the chemical composition, everything about the way Earth is, humanity has evolved to live within those constraints. That being the case, the starship dream is a fantasy. Well, okay, most people, I think, would have said, we always knew that. Why are you making a big deal of it? What I wanted to do was kill the idea that humanity is destined for the stars and that Earth, as Tsiolkovsky put it, is humanity's cradle. Earth is humanity's cradle, he said, but you're not meant to stay in your cradle forever. That was wrong. Earth is humanity's cradle, its hotel, its grave. It's the whole story for humanity is Earth. There is no planet B. This is a bumper sticker in America. I hope it's a phrase in every language. There is no planet B. The best candidate, Mars, is a 10,000-year project, maybe. But the stars, no, we'll never go there. And that means we have to take care of Earth if humanity is going to stay healthy over the long haul. So with Aurora, I wanted to make that case with a flourish. And so coming back to Earth at the end, let me add one more thing. If we were to get to a planet somewhere else, And I had to invent one around Tau Ceti because we know the planets around Tau Ceti, none of them are any good for us, but there might be an Earth-sized moon rotating around one of them that we don't know about. I got help from NASA scientists all through this book, I must say. So if we get to another planet, it is either alive or dead. If it's dead, you have to terraform it with only the resources of a single starship. That's hard and bad. It extends the lifetime of your time in the starship by perhaps double what you've already been there. If the planet is alive, the life forms on that planet will either be poisonous to you, or else you might be poisonous to them, or you might be innocuous to each other. It could be anything, but it's a big problem. And how do you test that? Do you go out into the atmosphere and see if you die or not? Well, no. How do you test that? You send some rats in a cage out on the surface, see if they live or die. I mean, once you acknowledge that problem, you realize we can't go to the stars for many, many reasons that add up together to a near impossibility. So I needed to tell that story, and I needed to come back to Earth and show that Earth has been damaged by this space dream, people not paying attention, not taking care of their one and only home. So they actually are rebuilding the beaches artificially that our starfarers return to at the end of the story. I think the novel has had an impact on the thinking of the science fiction community. As to the larger culture, I can't say.
Et pour juste illustrer un tout petit peu, vous citer un petit peu, si on avait eu plus de temps, je vous aurais volontiers proposé de vous lire des extraits en français, malheureusement, sur justement la fin de ce roman Aurora. Vous écrivez « Les terriens ont tenté de stabiliser le climat de la planète, bien sûr, mais rien n'y a fait. Et il leur faudra encore quelques milliers d'années pour y parvenir. Et oui, la planète qu'ils terraforment désormais, c'est la Terre. Ils n'ont pas le choix. Les dégâts sont trop gros. Retour à la Terre. Ils n'ont pas le choix. Nous n'avons pas le choix. » Et il y a, je crois, un roman qui n'est pas traduit, que vous avez écrit récemment, qui est un vrai retour à la Terre et qui est un retour en arrière, près de 40 000 ans en arrière, qui se déroule du côté de la grotte Chauvet. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous dire un mot sur l'intérêt que vous avez ressenti finalement à retourner non seulement sur Terre, mais dans le temps, finalement, dans l'autre sens? Est-ce que ça vous aide dans le même temps, finalement, à aussi penser la suite, le prolongement d'Homo sapiens?
Well, yes, that is one of the main reasons that I wrote Shaman is if you're writing science fiction, well, there's two aspects to this. One, science fiction divides down into subgenres, and I wanted to write a novel in each of the subgenres of science fiction. The space story, the planet story, the near future dystopia, the alternative history, and traditionally, prehistory, the story of humans before there was history, has been included as part of a science fiction subgenre for interesting reasons, because it's the history that we can never quite know before written history and then the future. This is unknowable history is what science fiction often does. So I had always been interested. And then when the Chauvet caves were discovered around 1995, I was fascinated. They were twice as old as Lascaux, and this art style was the same. Imagine the cultural continuities where for thousands of years, without writing, human cultures were keeping steady in their lifestyles and in their art forms, and I would presume in their languages. This is astonishing and worth investigating for itself. And then this science fiction question of what could we become as human beings, it rests on a question of how did we become what we are? So the historical continuity, if you try to think forward, you need to think backwards. And then again, it was a new story. There was no way, archaeology itself as a science has given us new ways to think the Paleolithic period. We know more about 30,000 years ago human life than we have ever known. that will continue, but it's almost like Mars. There's been an explosion of information coming from DNA studies and new discoveries. So I'm happy to report, to end this part, that Shaman will appear in French, since it's almost the only novel. Well, that's not quite true. My novels go to France fairly often. The Mars trilogy, The Years of Rice and Salt, and Shaman, though, is entirely set in France, almost. And so it will be published in France by Bragelonne I think in the late 2022. And I'm really happy to report that. I've wanted that ever since it came out.
Merci pour l'information donc à suivre effectivement en 2022 et pour clore et faire le lien avec l'échange qui va suivre animé par Michel Lusseau. Vous avez évoqué cette question du droit qui effectivement est évidemment un champ à investir pour penser cette question de l'extension de l'œcumène. Vous avez évoqué la notion de commun qui est aujourd'hui discutée de manière très fructueuse et je voulais également vous soumettre cette nouvelle manière de penser notre rapport à l'environnement, au non-humain, qui passe par l'idée de conférer une personnalité juridique à certaines de ces composantes de l'environnement. Ça peut être un bassin hydrographique, ça peut être la forêt amazonienne, ça peut être la Lune. Là, je fais référence à cette déclaration de la Lune qui sera abordée par Alice Gorman. Est-ce que c'est pour vous une manière de penser et d'agir aussi qui vous parle, cette question de conférer finalement une personnalité juridique à la Lune, à Mars, à d'autres, je dirais, éléments de notre univers, finalement? Est-ce que ça entre en résonance aussi avec certaines de vos réflexions?
It's a very good question, and I would say that the distinction that makes it a difficult one is the presence of life or the absence of life. So a forest should be a citizen, a river should be a citizen. In Ecuador, in New Zealand, in Wales, around the world, we're beginning to see that living creatures and ecosystems, animals and biomes, are achieving legal standing so that they can be defended in court by humans who speak for them. And law is crucial. But what about a dead object like the moon, a rock in space? Well, you don't want to be looking up at it and seeing advertisements. It has a deep connection to human evolution, to the evolution of life on Earth. It would be the same thing as the satellites littering the sky so that you can't see the stars well anymore, but just our own moving objects. It would be bad enough that perhaps the defense of it should not be for any intrinsic value, as they put it in environmental ethics, of the moon per se, but a human utilitarian value in that it has a non-economic but powerfully real value to us as itself untrammeled. And if that will have legal ramifications. If you're doing stuff on the moon that you can't see from Earth, does it matter? And isn't it okay if it helps humanity one way or another? A scientific base at the South Pole where there's frozen water, that kind of endeavor seems to me to be a valid human endeavor where the moon does not speak and wouldn't care because it's unconscious. So there's something strange about the moon and Mars where the kind of environmental ethics and legal standing that we're trying to work up for living systems of our biosphere on Earth. So Gaia should have legal standing, but the moon, maybe this is just a rock that humans make what they will of. There will be complications legally as to who gets to do what up there. But I don't think the moon intrinsically as its own object is an actor in this actor network, or not a legally valid person in the way that I would say an antelope or a river is a legally valid person, a river biosphere. So these are questions that obviously get complicated and interesting, and we'll be hearing more about that from Alice, I'm sure. And I'm glad that they're being talked about now. This is the great thing about talking about them now, is that as they hit us, as they come so fast, we'll have some mental preparation and maybe even some legal thought already given to the problem.
Merci, un très grand merci Kim Stanley Robinson. Nous arrivons au terme de notre échange, de ce temps que vous nous avez consacré. Donc un grand merci pour votre disponibilité, pour nous avoir aussi, je dirais, commenté cette œuvre et donné des clés de lecture. Pour la suite, nous en avons vraiment besoin. Et là, de ce point de vue-là, effectivement, vous nous apportez énormément de ressources. Donc, continuez aussi à nous faire voyager dans le temps, dans l'espace, à nous aider aussi à nous y positionner à une époque aussi complexe. Voilà, donc encore un très grand merci. Et puis donc, au plaisir de vous lire sur le dernier ouvrage que vous avez annoncé, qui se passe du côté de l'Ardèche. Merci.
Well, I want to say quickly thank you for your questions, which were, I love them because they were new and yet right what I think about when I'm thinking. And then I want to thank my French editor, Tom Clegg of Bragelonne, for his immense help in getting my last several novels into French. And I'm now, with Tom's work, all of my novels will end up being translated into French, and that means a great deal to me. It's the one and only language that I have struggled into a semi-reading comprehension of. And I hope to see people in person in the coming few years in France, if the pandemic allows. So thank you very much.
Merci.